"Please, don't carry me to bed," trapped Apache girl said rancher. Instead, James McGregor rode through the dense forest, his thoughts consumed by the tasks waiting for him back at the ranch. The day had barely begun, but already the sun peeked through the trees, promising to turn the morning into another hot one. Pace. His weathered face showed the signs of a man who had lived through many summers on the frontier. Rough, tired, and focused. He was used to the isolation, the long hours, and the hard work of ranching. It was a life he had chosen, and it suited him just fine. But today was different. As James passed by the stream that ran through the edge of his property, he heard a faint noise, a soft cry, almost as if the wind was whispering through the trees. He paused, scanning the surrounding area, trying to figure out if it had been his imagination. The sound came again, clearer this time. It was the unmistakable sound of a voice in distress. Without a second thought, James urged his horse forward, pushing through the thick brush toward the source of the cry. The forest was quiet now, save for the crunch of twigs under his horse's hooves. His heart beat faster as he followed the sound deeper into the woods. He pushed past a thicket and then saw it, a young girl trapped beneath a fallen tree. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with fear, and her body pinned to the ground by the weight of the branches. Her clothes were torn, and she looked as though she had been through more than just the ordeal of being stuck. James dismounted his horse and rushed to her side, his hands shaking slightly as he reached out to lift the heavy log off her. "Hey, are you all right?" he asked gently, his voice calm and reassuring. The girl winced but nodded faintly, tears pooling in her eyes. She was breathing heavily, her chest rising and falling in quick succession. It was clear she was in pain, but there was no sign of any broken bones. But still, her situation was dire. He had to get her to safety. James quickly assessed her injuries, realizing she needed help beyond what he could offer in the middle of the woods. He bent down and tried to lift her carefully, but she cried out in protest, her small frame shuddering with a mix of fear and pain. "Please, don't carry me to bed," she whispered hoarsely. The words were soft but urgent, as if she feared something worse than the pain she was already enduring. James paused, surprised by her response. It took him a moment to register what she had said.
The girl was trying to refuse his help, even though it was clear she couldn't move on her own.
He hesitated, unsure of what to do next. He had always been taught to help others in need, to never leave someone in distress. But this girl was different. There was something in her eyes that told him there was more to her refusal than just pride. Breaths. "Why?" James asked quietly, his voice soft and steady. He wasn't going to push her, but he needed to understand. She seemed to struggle with the question for a moment, her gaze shifting away from him as she fought to gather her thoughts. I can't," she finally replied, her voice barely audible. I don't want to owe anyone. Please, just help me get up." James sighed, realizing that she was more concerned about her dignity than her pain. It was a matter of pride for her, he guessed. She had probably been taught to rely only on herself, to never show weakness. He could see it now, in the way she held herself despite the obvious suffering. He nodded and carefully helped her sit up, making sure she didn't try to stand just yet. Breaths. "You don't owe me anything," he said gently, his voice soothing. "I'm just helping you because it's the right thing to do." "Desk, you don't have to do anything in return." The girl's eyes flickered, and for a moment James thought she might argue further, but instead she let out a long, weary sigh and allowed him to support her.
He helped her lean against the tree, his arms steady and firm as he tried to make her as comfortable as possible.
"Who did this to you?" James asked, trying to understand the full extent of her situation. "How did you end up here?"
She flinched at the question, and for a moment James thought she might refuse to answer,
But then she spoke, her voice filled with a mixture of sadness and determination. "I'm from the Apache tribe," she said slowly, as if testing the words. "First, I was separated from my people during a raid. They took us. I escaped, but I've been alone for days." The words hit James like a punch to the gut. He had heard stories of the violence that plagued the land, of raids and clashes between settlers and the native tribes. But hearing it from her, seeing the fear in her eyes, made it all too real.
I don't know where they are now," she continued, her voice trailing off.
Bray, bay, 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 bay. I just kept moving, hoping I could find my way back, as if she didn't want to finish the thought. James felt a surge of sympathy for her, but also a deep sense of guilt. Here she was, a young girl, stranded and alone in a vast wilderness, and he had no way of knowing if the dangers she feared were still out there, or if she had escaped them. He knew he couldn't just leave her here, not after everything she had been through. "Don't worry," he said quietly, kneeling down to meet her eyes. "You're safe now."
"I'll take care of you." The girl didn't respond right away.
Instead, she looked at him warily, as if unsure whether she could trust him. James could see the conflict in her eyes, the need for help, but the resistance to rely on someone else. He took a deep breath, trying to think of the best way to reassure her.
"I'll help you get back on your feet," he said, his tone calm but firm.
"But you need to rest for now. You've been through a lot, and you need time to heal." The girl nodded hesitantly, still clutching the tree for support.
James could tell she wasn't used to being vulnerable, and the thought of being cared for by someone else was a foreign concept to her. But she had no other choice. Direction.
She was too weak to walk on her own, and James knew the journey back to his ranch would be a difficult one. "I won't carry you to bed," James added with a slight smile, trying to lighten the mood.
"But I'll make sure you get there safely." She gave him a small, wary smile in return, as if she wasn't entirely sure how to respond. It was a small step, but it was a step nonetheless. James could feel a shift in the air, a moment of connection between them. He wasn't just a stranger helping her out of pity. For the first time, she saw him as someone she could rely on. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely above a breath. James stood up and surveyed the situation. The forest around them was quiet, too quiet for his liking. He knew the risks of traveling these woods alone, especially with someone who wasn't used to the dangers of the land. But there was no turning back now. He had to get her to safety. With one final glance at her, he helped her to her feet, supporting her as best as he could. They began the journey back to his ranch, a journey that would test both of them in ways they couldn't yet understand. But for now, all that mattered was that they were no longer alone in the wilderness. Together, they would find a way forward. Breath. James had never expected his day to turn out like this. One moment he was going about his usual routine, and the next, he found himself caring for a young girl who had clearly been through unimaginable hardships. It wasn't just the physical pain she had endured. Her eyes told the story of a much deeper suffering. Every time he spoke to her, she would retreat slightly, her gaze distant, as if she was trying to block out the world around her. Despite her reluctance to show any vulnerability, James could tell she was slowly starting to trust him, if only a little. She had allowed him to help her sit up when she had been trapped under the fallen tree, and now, as they made their way back to the ranch, she seemed to be less afraid of him. He had no idea what had happened to her or what kind of life she had lived before this moment, but he knew that he couldn't let her face it alone. As they walked back to the ranch, the path seemed endless. The sun was still high in the sky, but the weight of the girl's silence made the day feel longer than it actually was. James noticed how she limped slightly, her injured leg slowing her pace, though she never once complained. It was clear she had been trained to endure pain without showing it. The ranch was just beyond the tree line, and as they neared it, James felt a sense of relief wash over him. He knew the house would be a place of comfort, a safe haven where he could help her rest and heal. He had a small cabin, simple but sturdy, and it was the only place that offered any sense of peace in the middle of the wilderness. As they approached the cabin, James could see his horse tied up near the porch, and the familiar sight of the ranch slowly began to calm his nerves. When they reached the door, James gently helped the girl up the small step and into the cabin. She didn't say anything as she crossed the threshold, but he could see her eyes dart around, taking in every detail. Perhaps she was surprised by how simple the place was. There wasn't much, just a fire burning in the hearth, a small wooden table with chairs, a few shelves with jars of preserved food, and a bed tucked into the far corner of the room. It was a humble home, but had everything a man needed to survive on his own. "Sit here," James said as he gestured to a chair by the table. "I'll get you some water." The girl didn't respond, but she sat down where he had pointed, her movements slow and careful, as though every step took great effort. James quickly filled a cup with water from a nearby jug and brought it over to her. He set it down gently on the table and waited for her to drink. For a moment, the girl just stared at the cup, her fingers hovering over it but never quite touching it. James could see the internal struggle in her eyes. He didn't push her. He simply waited, knowing that whatever had happened to her, she needed time to process. Finally, she reached out and took the cup in both hands, her fingers trembling slightly as she brought it to her lips. She drank slowly, as though savoring the simple comfort of it. James watched her quietly, trying not to make her feel self-conscious. He wasn't sure what she had been through, but he knew that trust wasn't something that could be rushed. When she finished the water, she set the cup down on the table and looked up at him. There was a brief moment of silence before she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you," she said. James nodded.
"You're welcome," he replied simply, not wanting to say anything that might push her further away.
He could tell she wasn't ready to talk much yet, and he didn't want to force her. For the rest of the day, James went about his usual chores. He worked on the ranch, keeping an eye on the girl as she rested in the cabin. He offered her food, but she barely touched it, only picking at the bread and cheese he had given her. He didn't mind. He knew she was probably too exhausted to eat much. As the day turned into evening, the cabin grew warmer, with the fire crackling in the hearth. James sat down at the table opposite the girl. The air between them was thick with unspoken words, but he knew that now wasn't the time to push for answers.
He let the silence stretch on, knowing that it was just as important for her to find her voice as it was for him to give her the space to do so.
After a while, the girl shifted in her chair, glancing at James. Her eyes were softer now, less guarded than they had been when he first found her. She wasn't looking at him with suspicion anymore. Instead, there was a quiet curiosity in her gaze.
"Why are you helping me?" she asked suddenly, her voice low but clear.
It was the first question she had asked him all day. James leaned back in his chair, taking a moment to consider his answer. He didn't want to give her some canned response, something that might make her feel like he was only helping her out of some sense of duty. The truth was, he didn't know why he had done it. He had simply acted on instinct, seeing a girl in need and responding in the only way he knew how.
"I guess I just couldn't leave you out there," James said finally.
"I've been out here alone for a long time. I know what it's like to be by yourself, to have no one to turn to. When I saw you, I just wanted to help." The girl seemed to consider his words for a moment, her eyes lowering to the table as she thought. Brow. James watched her carefully, sensing that she was trying to process everything that had happened. "I don't belong here," she said after a long silence. "I don't belong anywhere." James felt a pang in his chest at the sadness in her voice. He had heard of the struggles the native people faced, how they had been pushed to the edges of the land, forced to adapt to a world that didn't understand them. But hearing it from her, seeing the pain in her eyes, made it more real than he had ever imagined. "You're not alone," James said gently. "Narration. You're here now. You've got a place to stay, and you don't have to go anywhere unless you want to." The girl looked up at him, her eyes searching his face for any hint of insincerity. "Brace." James held her gaze, giving her the quiet assurance that she wasn't just a stranger to him. She was someone who mattered. "I don't know how to trust anyone," she said quietly, almost as if she was speaking to herself. "I've learned not to." "I get it," he said softly. "Trust isn't something that comes easily. But you don't have to trust me all at once. Just take it one step at a time." For the rest of the evening they spoke little. James did most of the talking, telling her about the ranch, the animals, the land. Bias. She listened in silence, occasionally offering a small nod or a brief comment, but her attention was divided. He didn't mind. It was enough that she was there, that she was beginning to open up, even in small ways. As the night wore on, James built up the fire, making sure the cabin stayed warm. The girl, now resting on the bed he had set up for her, seemed to relax a little more with each passing minute. She was still wary, still distant, but for the first time since he had found her, she didn't seem as frightened. James lay down on his own bed, the soft creak of the wooden floor the only sound in the room. He knew the next few days would be challenging, both for him and for her. But he also knew that they had made it through the first day, and that was something. It was a small victory, but it was a victory nonetheless, Brask. Tomorrow would bring its own set of challenges, but for now, they were safe. And that was enough. The days that followed were both long and quiet. James went about his usual routines, doing the chores that were necessary to keep the ranch running. But now, there was someone else. At the cabin. Someone who had never known the comfort of a place like this. Someone who was still haunted by the memories of the past.
Ayana, the young Apache girl, had become an unexpected presence in James's life.
Each day she seemed to grow a little stronger, but her inner battles were far from over. At first she remained mostly silent, sitting by the window and watching the land outside, her gaze often distant, as if searching for something, or perhaps someone, that wasn't there. She didn't want to engage in much conversation. It was as though she feared that if she spoke, it would make her situation real. The reality was that she had nowhere else to go. She was no longer part of her tribe, and she didn't know what her future held. But slowly, she began to adjust to the rhythm of ranch life. James respected her need for space. He didn't try to push her into conversations or make her feel obligated to share her story. He understood that some wounds took time to heal. All he could offer was the security of his home, and he hoped it was enough.
Ayana spent her days sitting quietly, occasionally helping with small tasks when she felt strong enough.
She would gather wood for the fire, clean the dishes, or feed the chickens. These small actions seemed to ease her mind, giving her something to focus on other than her own thoughts. She wasn't used to relying on someone else for help, but over time she began to accept James's kindness without questioning it. It was a small, unspoken shift, but it was important. James kept his distance, but he made sure she knew that he was there if she ever needed anything. He often found himself watching her from a distance, wondering what was going on inside her mind. He could see the way her eyes flickered with memories, sometimes shadowed by pain. There was a quiet strength about her, but it was also clear that she had been deeply affected by the life she had left behind. As the sun began to dip low in the sky, casting a warm glow over the ranch, James found Ayanna standing by the fence, staring out over the field. She was deep in thought, her expression unreadable. He walked up behind her slowly, making sure not to startle her.
"You like the view?" he asked gently, leaning against the fence next to her.
Ayanna turned her head slightly, meeting his eyes for the first time in a while. There was a small shift in her gaze, something that told James she had been thinking about her future, or perhaps her past. But for a moment she just stood there, not answering his question. "The land is beautiful," she said at last, her voice quiet, almost lost in the breeze. I never thought I'd see something like this. So calm. Bration. So, rasp. James nodded. "It's peaceful here. Nothing too fancy, but it's home." Ayanna turned her eyes back to the field, her gaze lingering on the horizon. "I didn't grow up like this, my people. We were always on the move."
Always traveling. I never stayed in one place long enough to see the same sunrise twice.
Her voice cracked slightly as she spoke, the weight of her words heavy in the air. She didn't look at him as she said it, but James could hear the sorrow in her tone. It was the kind of sorrow that didn't just vanish. It lingered. James was quiet for a moment, taking in her words. He knew she was still struggling with the idea of what had happened to her people. She had seen her world change, and she hadn't chosen it. It had been taken from her. "If you want," James said after a pause, "you can stay here as long as you need. I won't ask any questions." Ayanna glanced at him, her eyes filled with uncertainty. It wasn't the first time he had said something like that, but this time there was a flicker of something in her eyes. Free. Maybe it was hope, or maybe it was just exhaustion, but it was something James hadn't seen in her before. She nodded slowly, but didn't say anything more. The silence stretched between them. Not uncomfortable, but full of the kind of understanding that only comes from shared solitude. James didn't press her to speak, and Ayanna didn't offer more than she was ready to share.
As the days passed, Ayanna's routine became more settled.
She continued to help out with small tasks, though James noticed she was growing stronger. She moved more easily, and the faraway look in her eyes started to fade, replaced by a quiet determination. But there were moments, still, when she would retreat into herself, as if the weight of her past was too much to bear. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the sky in hues of purple and orange, James decided it was time to check on Ayanna's progress. He had been giving her space, but he knew that she couldn't remain isolated forever. It was time to gently encourage her to open up, if only a little. Breaths. He found her sitting by the fire, staring into the flames. Her fingers traced the edge of a small stone she had found earlier in the day. Her movements slow and deliberate. She didn't seem to notice him at first, so James sat down beside her, keeping a respectful distance. "Ayanna," he said softly, "I know it's not easy, but I want you to know that you're not alone anymore. You don't have to carry everything by yourself." She didn't look at him, but she spoke after a long silence. "I don't know how to let go of it," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I don't know how to stop feeling like I'm always running." James nodded. "I understand," he said gently. "But you don't have to run anymore. You can stay here. You can take your time." Ayanna's eyes flickered toward him for a brief moment, and he saw the hesitation in them. She was scared. Scared of trusting again. Scared of letting herself be vulnerable. But there was something else there, too. Something that James had hoped to see. The beginnings of relief. "I don't know if I'll ever feel safe," she said quietly. But I think I could try." James smiled softly, knowing that was the most he could ask for. Sometimes, trust wasn't something that could be given all at once. It had to be earned, slowly, over time. And Ayana was beginning to understand that. Little by little, the next few days were filled with small changes. Ayana began to open up a little more, speaking to James in short bursts, though she still wasn't ready to share much of her past.
She helped with the chores more freely, her actions becoming less stiff and cautious.
Ray pantsed that she smiled occasionally now, a small, fleeting thing that gave him hope for what could come. One afternoon, after finishing some work outside, James came into the cabin to find Ayana sitting by the window, watching the clouds drift by. Her face was relaxed, and for the first time since he had met her, she seemed at peace. "I've never seen clouds like these," she said, almost to herself. "They remind me of my home back when we used to travel. The sky was always so wide."
James walked over to the window and stood next to her.
Desperate. "The sky's always wide out here. It doesn't matter where you come from. The horizon always feels the same." Ayana turned to look at him, and for the first time there was no hesitation in her gaze. She gave him a small smile, one that reached her eyes. "Maybe," she said softly, "this could be home, too." Days turned into weeks, and the quiet routine of life on the ranch began to settle in. James and Ayana's days were filled with work, but there was something peaceful about it now. They were no longer strangers, though they still moved around each other with the caution of people who were slowly learning to trust. Each day, Ayana seemed to grow a little stronger, and James found himself more at ease with the unspoken connection between them. James had kept his word. He never pushed Ayana to talk about her past. He knew it was something that would take time, if it came at all. But he didn't mind. The days were enough for him. For now, just sharing the same space was a step forward. Ayana had started helping more around the ranch. She tended to the animals, fed the chickens, and helped James with the heavy work. Every so often, she would still retreat into her silence. But James had learned to respect that. It wasn't out of coldness, but from a quiet need to process everything on her own terms. She didn't need words to communicate. Her actions spoke for her. When she smiled, even if it was brief, it was enough to remind James that she wasn't as closed off as she had been when he first found her. The mornings were spent working, while the evenings were a time for rest. The two of them would sit together by the fire, the silence between them comfortable, broken only by the crackling of the wood and the occasional soft words exchanged about the day. They never talked much, but that was all right. The peace of the ranch seemed to fill the gaps that words couldn't reach. One morning James woke early, the sun just starting to rise over the hills. He had always been an early riser, but that morning something was different. The air felt heavy with anticipation, as if the world itself was waiting for something to happen. He knew Ayana had been struggling with the weight of her past for a long time, but he also knew that at some point she would have to face it. It wasn't that James was trying to push her. He didn't want her to feel pressured to share what had happened, but there were days when the quiet between them became unbearable. He could see it in her eyes, the way she would sometimes stare into the distance, as if lost in a memory that haunted her. He knew she needed to find a way to make peace with what had happened. But how? As James stood by the fire that morning, watching the embers burn down, he heard the sound of footsteps behind him. Ayana was standing in the doorway, her figure silhouetted against the soft morning light. "Morning," she said, her voice low, as if unsure of how to begin. She was still adjusting to the mornings, to the calm of the ranch.
"Good morning,"
James replied, turning to face her.
"Oh, Gotti."
"How are you feeling today?" Ayana hesitated for a moment before answering. Better. Stronger, I think. James nodded, sensing the change in her. She no longer seemed as fragile, as if the weight of the world was pressing down on her. She was starting to rise above it, little by little. You've been helping a lot lately, he said, gesturing to the barn where they had been working the day before. It's good to see you up and moving around. Ayana smiled, but it was a small smile, one that didn't quite reach her eyes. Rasp.
I like to keep busy. It helps keep my mind from wandering.
James didn't press her further. He understood. The mind could be a dangerous thing when left to its own devices, and sometimes it was easier to focus on physical tasks than to confront painful memories. Still, James couldn't help but feel a sense of urgency. He wanted her to find peace, to be able to live without the constant weight of her past hanging over her. We'll be finishing up the barn today,
he said.
Would you like to help me with it?
Ayana hesitated, looking out at the barn in the distance. I'm not sure if I can.
I've never done work like that before. James smiled softly. It's nothing you can't handle. I'll show you how, and if it's too much, you can stop any time. For a moment, Ayana said nothing. Her gaze was fixed on the barn, her face a mix of uncertainty and curiosity. James could tell she was considering the offer, thinking it over, and then, slowly, she nodded.
Okay,
she said.
I'll help. It wasn't a grand gesture, but it was a step forward. Ayana wasn't used to relying on anyone, but she was beginning to see that it was okay to ask for help sometimes.
It was a quiet, important shift, a sign that she was starting to trust again, even if she didn't fully understand what that meant. The day passed quickly as they worked together. Ayana's hands were steady as she helped James with the repairs. And by the end of the day, the barn was nearly finished. It was a satisfying feeling knowing that they had accomplished something together. Brace. James could see the pride in Ayana's eyes as she stood back and looked at the work they had done. It wasn't just the barn that had been rebuilt. Something inside Ayana had shifted too. As the sun began to set, casting a warm glow over the land, they took a break, sitting on the porch and watching the sky change colors. The silence between them was comfortable, but James couldn't ignore the nagging feeling in the back of his mind. Round. He knew Ayana was still struggling with her past, and he wondered if she would ever be able to let go of it. You know, he said quietly, breaking the silence. There's no rush. You don't have to move forward if you're not ready.
Ayana turned to him, her eyes soft but distant.
I'm not sure if I'll ever be ready, she said. There are things in my past that I don't know how to let go of. James nodded, understanding more than she knew. He had his own burdens, his own past that he wasn't always able to escape, but he had learned, over the years, that healing wasn't a destination. It was a journey, and sometimes it took longer than expected. You don't have to let go of everything, he said gently. Just take it, one day at a time. Start with the things you can handle, and maybe the rest will follow when you're ready. Ayana looked down at her hands, which were still dusty from the day's work. For a moment she said nothing, her thoughts clearly elsewhere. But then she looked up at James, her eyes searching his face as if looking for something she couldn't name. Psst. Maybe, she said quietly. Maybe I can do that. James smiled softly, his heart lifting slightly. It wasn't much, but it was enough. In that moment, he realized that healing wasn't about fixing everything at once. It was about the small steps, the moments of connection, the quiet reassurance that one wasn't alone. The rest of the evening passed in a peaceful stillness, the two of them sitting on the porch as the stars began to twinkle in the sky above. Ayana didn't say much, but James could sense the shift in her. There was a quiet strength in her now, something that had been absent when she first arrived. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was beginning to live again, to feel the weight of the world lifting bit by bit. James didn't know what the future would hold for either of them, but for the first time he didn't feel the need to rush. He would let Ayana take her time. Whatever her journey looked like, he would be there to help her, just as she had helped him in ways she might never fully understand. The night grew cooler, and James stood up, stretching his stiff muscles. "I think it's time for bed," he said. "We've got another long day tomorrow." Ayana stood too, and for the first time in a long time she smiled. A real smile, one that reached her eyes.
"I think I'll sleep well tonight."
James smiled back, his heart a little lighter than it had been that morning.
"Good night, Ayana. Good night,"
she replied, her voice softer than usual. As she turned and walked into the cabin, James watched her for a moment, the last of the sunlight casting a golden glow over her silhouette. There was still a long way to go, but tonight, at least, there was a sense of peace between them. And that, for now, was enough. The days after their shared moment on the porch seemed to flow in a peaceful rhythm. The air was warm and clear, and the days stretched on, not hurried but filled with quiet moments that gradually built the trust between James and Ayana. She was still a bit reserved, but her presence no longer felt like a stranger in his home. Instead, it felt like the beginning of something he hadn't realized he needed. James had always lived alone on the ranch, used to the solitude and the quiet. But now, with Ayana there, it was as if the place was filled with a new kind of life, one that was softer, more human. He still didn't know everything about her past, and he wasn't going to push her to share it, but he could see how much she had changed since the day he had found her in the woods. She was becoming more than just a survivor. She was starting to feel like she belonged. It was early one morning when things took a slight turn. The sky was just beginning to lighten, the first hints of dawn spreading across the horizon. Ayana had been up long before James, which wasn't unusual. She often woke up early, her eyes opening before the sun had fully risen. James had learned to give her that space, not questioning her routines. He often found her by the window, watching the world wake up, lost in thoughts that he could only guess at. On this particular morning, however, he found her not by the window but standing by the barn, looking out across the field. Her body was slightly bent forward, as if she was listening to something far away. James hesitated for a moment before walking over to her. The distance between them seemed to shrink with every step he took, and yet there was still that silent barrier, the one that had kept them from speaking fully about what had happened to her.
"Ayana!" he called gently, not wanting to startle her.
She turned her head slightly at the sound of his voice but didn't look directly at him. Her gaze remained fixed on the distant hills. "It's beautiful here," she said softly, as though she were speaking more to herself than to him. "I never thought I'd find a place like this."
"I thought I would always be running." James stood beside her, his hands tucked into his pockets. He didn't say anything right away, not wanting to interrupt her thoughts.
The quiet stretch of land in front of them seemed to hold a kind of peace that Ayana hadn't known for a long time. He could sense the shift in her, how the weight of her past was still there, but it was lighter now, not so all-consuming. She wasn't running anymore. Not physically, at least. "I used to think that too," James finally said, his voice low. "I used to think I was running, too. From everything." Ayana turned her head slightly toward him, surprised by his admission, but she said nothing, waiting for him to continue. James took a breath, then spoke again, his gaze on the distant horizon. "I left home when I was young, but you learn something along the way. You can't outrun it. You can only face it." Ayana didn't reply at first. but her eyes flickered toward him, as if she were really seeing him for the first time.
It was a subtle shift, but it was there.
There was something in his words that resonated with her, something she hadn't quite put into words herself.
Do you think I'll ever stop feeling like I'm running? She asked, the words coming out quietly, almost as if she were afraid of asking them.
She didn't look at him when she spoke, her focus still on the land, on the sky. James thought for a moment. I don't know. Maybe. But I do know this. You don't have to run anymore. Not from me and not from yourself.
You found a place where you can stay if you want.
Ayanna turned her head to look at him, her eyes soft and searching. She didn't say anything for a long time, and James could see the internal battle within her. He had seen that look before, in people who were trying to decide whether or not to let go of a part of themselves they had carried for too long. She took a deep breath, her shoulders rising and falling, before she spoke again. Breaths. I want to stay, she said quietly, her voice full of uncertainty. But I don't know how. James smiled gently, his gaze warm. You don't have to know right now. Just take it one day at a time.
You've already started. Ayanna's lips twitched into a small, almost imperceptible smile.
But still, there was a hint of doubt in her eyes. It wasn't something she could just let go of easily, and he knew that. Brown.
Healing wasn't something that happened overnight. The next few days followed a similar rhythm.
Ayanna began to help more around the ranch, working with James as they took care of the animals and tended to the land. She still had her quiet moments when she would retreat into herself, but they were becoming less frequent. But she didn't talk much about her past. But James noticed the way she would sometimes pause, as if reliving a moment, and then quickly shake it off. It was a small gesture, but it was progress. One afternoon, as they worked together to fix a broken fence, James noticed how easily they were starting to fall into a pattern. The silence wasn't heavy anymore. It was companionable, filled with the sound of work being done. Ayanna was beginning to fit in. She wasn't just surviving on the ranch. She was becoming a part of it. At the end of the day, when they sat down to eat, James noticed how Ayanna seemed more relaxed than she had before. She didn't look over her shoulder as much, didn't seem to be lost in thoughts that pulled her away from the present. But for the first time, she looked like she was here. Not just physically, but mentally.
She was beginning to feel like she belonged.
Thank you for letting me stay, she said that evening, as they sat by the fire. Her voice was softer than usual, and her words had a weight to them that James hadn't heard before. It was as if she had finally accepted what he had been offering all along.
You don't have to thank me, James replied, his voice warm.
You're not a guest here anymore. You're part of this place, part of the family. Ayanna's eyes met his, and for a moment, the weight of her past seemed to lift. It wasn't gone, and James knew it never truly would be, but for the first time she didn't seem to be carrying it alone. She had a place now, a place where she was wanted, where she could rest, where she didn't have to run. That night, as they sat together, the fire flickering softly between them, there was a quiet understanding that passed between them.
Ayanna wasn't just a survivor anymore.
She was someone who had found a place to heal, someone who had been given the space to rebuild not just her life, but her sense of self. And though there would still be difficult days ahead, when the past threatened to resurface, James knew that she wasn't alone anymore. And neither was he. For the first time in a long time, they both had something that couldn't be taken away. Peace, trust, and the kind of quiet bond that only grew stronger with time. As the night wore on and the stars filled the sky, they sat together in comfortable silence, the weight of the past beginning to feel a little lighter.
It wasn't gone, but it didn't define them anymore.
Together, they were beginning to look toward a future that held more than just survival. It held the possibility of something new, and that, in itself, was enough.